In this lesson, we'll learn how to enable and define our perspective grid. Alright, now before we get started, I just want to go ahead and let you know that for this course, we'll be working under the assumption that you already understand the basics of linear perspective. If you don't understand the basics, you may be interested in checking out our course, Fundamentals of Perspective Drawing. We'll go into linear perspective in a lot more detail in that course, and it may benefit you in watching this one. So I also want to let you know that I want you to keep in mind throughout this course that Illustrator is not a 3D application. We're still working on a flat surface here. Really, the tools and the techniques that I'm going to be showing you here are an extension of traditional linear perspective drawing. And for the next couple of lessons, we're really going to be focusing on enabling and really customizing our grid. And I can't encourage how important this is before you get started drawing in perspective. You want to have a good vision for where your composition is going to go before you start drawing, because it's going to be really difficult to modify your artwork if you change your mind about the perspective later on. So I tell you what, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to need to go ahead and do is enable our perspective grid for this document. So I've just got basically a standard 12-inch by 12-inch document here, and lots of room to work on. And there's a couple of ways we can go about enabling our grid. We can come up here to our View drop-down menu. We can go to Perspective Grid, and we can choose this Show Grid option here. Notice the keyboard shortcut for this is Shift-Control-I. That's one way to enable the perspective grid for your document. Another way is just to come over here to your toolbox, and you're going to look underneath, for this Perspective Grid tool. Notice the keyboard shortcut for that is Shift-P. Either way, you choose either one of those, it's going to turn on the perspective grid for your document here. Now we're going to talk more about the perspective grid tool and really everything you see here on our artboard in the next lesson. So right now what I want to talk to you about is really defining this grid. So we're going to come up here to our View drop-down menu again, and again go to Perspective Grid here. Now notice that there's several options here under this menu. We can come up here and show rulers for our perspective grid and turn those on. You can see here that the perspective grid has its own system of rulers. We'll get into that more again in the next lesson, but notice here also in that same menu we can lock our grid. We can lock the station point, which essentially means if we move one vanishing point, we're going to move the other one. And we have some other options here. We're going to skip define grid. We can come over here and specify if we want a 1-point perspective, a 2-point, or a 3-point. Now notice here that by default in Illustrator, the default perspective grid is a 2-point perspective. We have 2 vanishing points here. So we're going to come up here and look how to change that. Let's come back to perspective grid here and look at this define grid option. Now we're going to get the define grid options here on our screen, and there's a lot of different options here. We're going to kind of walk through these so you know what each one of these does. Now the first thing you see at the top of this dialog is the name field. Now we're going to get more into this in just a moment, but you can drop that down and you can select 1, 2, or 3-point perspective here. You can also select the type of perspective right here under type as well, whether you want the 1, 2, or 3-point perspective. You can select the unit of measure for your perspective grid. Right now by default it's set to points, but we can also change that to centimeters, inches, or pixels. So the next option here is scale. Now you can see by default it's set 1:1. What this scale means is how the unit of measure on your artboard translates into real-world proportions. Right now it's set 1 increment on our artboard is set to that, or 1 unit on our artboard is the equivalent of that same unit in real-world proportions. Now we can set that here to a few different options, or we can even set a custom one here. You can see here all the way up to 1 and 100. I want to go ahead and leave this on 1:1 right now, since we're just going to be doing some basic drawing here. And you can see here the next option is how many grid lines we have. We can specify the exact distance between grid lines. I'm just going to go ahead and bump that up a little bit. Let's just say 50 points for right now. Now we've got here some other options here. The first of which you see here is viewing angle. Now, let's talk about viewing angle for just a moment here. If you imagine the screen that we're working on here as a window that we're looking at this composition through, and the 2 vanishing points, the one on the left and the one on the right, are points off in the distance. Right now, with 45 degrees as the angle, each one of those vanishing points is going to be an equal distance away from our screen. Now, if we increase this to a value greater than 45 degrees, that's going to mean the vanishing point over on the right is actually going to be closer to our window than the one on the left. If we set this value to less than 45 degrees, the vanishing point on the left is going to be closer to us, and the one on the right is going to be further away. Let me just go ahead and illustrate that for you. I'm going to go ahead and change the viewing angle's value to about 60 degrees. And let me just go ahead and hit OK. Notice that's really the only thing I've changed besides the frequency of the grid lines. And we'll just hit OK here. And you can see here what the effect on our perspective grid is. Now that we've increased that value to more than 45 degrees, this vanishing point on the right is actually going to be closer to us than the one on the left. So if we come back up here and define our grid again, and instead of raising our value by 15, we lower it, let's say 30 degrees. You can see that it switches it exactly the opposite. So for this lesson, or for this course, I'm going to go ahead and switch that back to 60 degrees. And let's go ahead and move on to the next value here. You see viewing distance is the next value. The viewing distance is essentially the distance between the viewer and the scene that we're drawing. Horizon height, let's go ahead and just move this out of the way. Now horizon height is going to be the distance between our horizon line and ground level. Now in our perspective grid, ground level is represented by this line right here. So right now we have that distance between these two lines set to 250 points. I'm going to go ahead and leave that as it is right now. You can see here we also have some options for coloration on our grid. Now we can set the left grid, the right grid, and the horizontal grid to different colors, and you can kind of just pair those colors up with which one we have. We have our left grid, our right grid, and our horizontal grid is this green one. Now, the last option here is for opacity, and this is purely a preferential thing, but you can change the opacity of your grid. Now, working in Illustrator, I personally feel that 50% is a little bit too dark for me. It tends to get in the way a little bit as I'm working on it, so I like to go ahead and lower that down to about 25% opacity. Alright, so we gone ahead and made some changes here to the default values for our perspective grid, and let's say we want to go ahead and save these values for use on future documents. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this Save Preset button so we can save these out, and we're going to get our little naming box here. So let's just call this My Grid for right now. And I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. So you can see here that that name now appears in this top field, and we can select it here from this drop-down list. And we'll just go ahead and hit OK on this dialog here to go back to our document. And you can see here that our grid has now been changed according to those changes we made there. Now, there's one other thing I want to show you how to do in this lesson, and that's how to export a grid preset for use on other machines, say. I'm going to come up here to my Edit drop-down menu, and we're going to choose Perspective Grid Presets. Alright, so we're going to get this same view. Now, notice here that we've got our 1, 2, and 3 point perspectives listed here as defaults. And if we select either one of those, you can see here that we have our settings down below. All the settings for that grid preset. Now, notice here that for these default ones, we can't edit or delete them. Those are there no matter if we want them there or not. But for the My Grid option that we just created, we can now come in and either edit by clicking this button and go back to that dialog that we were just at. We cancel that, or we can delete that grid preset right here from this dialog. Now, if you've been given a grid preset by someone else and you want to import that into your copy of Illustrator, this is the place to do that. You would actually hit this import button here, or if you, to contrast that, want to export your grid preset out so maybe somebody else can use your grid. You could just hit this export button right here. Let me go ahead and hit that now. Now notice here that the default directory that comes up is deep within the install directories of your copy of Adobe Illustrator. And you know what? This is actually where you would need to save this if you want this grid preset to show up in this dialog. Now, if you don't care about that, you want to export it out to your desktop or whatever, so you can email it to a friend or save it to a jump drive, whatever you want to do, that's fine. But if you want to go ahead and have that come up in your copy of Illustrator, save it in the default directory here. I'm going to go ahead and cancel this out. I don't want to export this for right now. So we've in this lesson learned how to both enable and define our perspective grid. In the next lesson, we'll pick up where we're leaving off here, and we're going to learn how to manipulate our perspective grid using some of these controls here on our artboard.